Hi, I'm Jerry Hogue,
And I'm Ryan Deerking.
and welcome to this week's chapter of the story. This week we're in chapter 19, chapter 20. Last week we were in chapter 19, where we talked about the Israelites coming back to the land and their focus and emphasis on building the temple, what that meant for them as far as God's presence with them and the restoration of their worship, and what it means for us today in terms of thinking about where God dwells today in us. This week in chapter 20, we could almost say, meanwhile, back at the ranch, because while those events were going on in the land of Judah and in the city of Jerusalem, back in Persia and Media, under the king Xerxes, he had deposed his existing queen and was in search of a new queen. And we find a young Jewish girl named Esther coming into the forefront as she was part of the group of young women that was gathered up to move into, to be considered as a potential queen by the king and hopefully selected by him. So as we discussed that in our Sunday school class, there were lots of interesting things that were said about her and Mordecai. One thing of note is that this is the one book in the Bible where the name of God is not mentioned. So in that regard, we selected a question from the back of the story for our discussion.
Yes, so we decided to choose question number 1. In that, what does this chapter of the story teach about God's work behind the scenes? Now, God is always working behind the scenes. It's just more so noticeable in this book in that he's not directly discussed, as Jerry mentioned, in any of the actions. It wasn't God told me to do this or talked in any particular way. And there's only one verse where there's even a slight hint. I think it's chapter 5, verse 14. But anyways, we wanted to look at a lot of the similarities between Esther and a previous individual, Joseph. Mm-hmm. And we can see in those two stories, both individuals were elevated to a place of power where they could have influence over many of the decisions that were going to be affecting the Israelite nation. Mm-hmm. But there are differences too. Esther, she didn't have a family. Her mother and father died. Right. And then Mordecai took her in as his daughter and raised her in a very, what we would suspect, a very good Jewish home, right, learning the laws and customs of their people. And that would also, we think, play out in her ultimately taking on the responsibility of helping save her people and going to the King Xerxes. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that while Joseph was able to recognize as soon as he saw his brothers that God had been at work the entire time, obviously Joseph was aware that God was allowing him in his slavery and in his prison time to be seen with favor by the people that were over him. They recognized that the Lord was blessing him, and that caused them to see him favorably and to move him into positions of leadership even in the prison. So when he saw his brothers, he said, "You meant this for bad, but God meant this for good. He put me in this place for this purpose, to save many lives."
And that's the exact same thing that Mordecai told Esther. God
Right.
put you in a place,
yes,
that you have the opportunity, and if you choose not to do it, God will raise somebody else.
Mm-hmm. When you mention the fact that Mordecai recognized that God was at work moving people into position so that they could play a key role, the key difference between Mordecai and Joseph is that Mordecai didn't say God's name, but he clearly was intimating that the Jewish people were going to be saved as God's children. And I'll reference the verse that Ryan referred to earlier. When he told Esther, sent word into her about what was happening and what he wanted her to do, "You need to go into the king and talk to him," she said, I can't do that. Unless you're called, you don't go to the king. And then that's when Mordecai gave her those words, "Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" And when those words of Mordecai come back to her, she says, "Okay, I'll go in to talk to the king, if I lose my life, I lose my life." So they clearly recognized that God was at work. And I say that because he was able to say that deliverance for the Jews is going to come from somewhere if you don't do it. And she, in turn, when she makes the commitment to say, okay, whether I'm called or not, I'm going to go in there and broach the subject with the king. The first action that she calls for is prayer and fasting. She sends him into the city and says, "Tell all the Jews to pray and to fast and pray for 3 days. And I and my maidens in the palace will do the same thing. And then I will go in before the king, and if I die, then I die." Right. So they were clearly, when you think about how they viewed things, even though they never said God's name, just as clearly they recognized that God was going to he was going to preserve the Jews, but they were certainly seeking his help and guidance in this instance, as she was going to go to the king.
So if we fast forward up to Paul's time,
Right.
we'd like to, and I'm pretty sure we mentioned this before, but again, we'd like to reference Ephesians 2, verse 10, where there Paul writes, "For we are God's workmanship, created in Jesus Christ to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do." I think over the course of our discussion here, it is clear that God's work, or God's hand, was at work here, and he had prepared a plan for Esther, and it was all for the preservation and the continuation, ultimately, to get to Jesus Christ.
Correct. So not only was she preserving the Jewish nation, but by virtue of preserving the Jewish nation, she was also preserving the lineage of the Savior who was to come. And as Ryan has pointed out, who knows what your role may be in God's plan at this point in time. But as he reminded us from Ephesians, God has a good work that he intends for each of us to do, that he determined before the foundation of the world.
Right. I think that probably wraps up this chapter, but we have one more remaining in the Old Testament, chapter 22, where we're going to talk about a few of the minor prophets right before
Nehemiah and Esther.
Yeah.
So we'll look forward to seeing you again next week for chapter 21, actually.
All right. See you.